involves nuclear weapons, it involves military attack plans, it involves our capabilities, our allies' capabilities. That to me was the other jaw-dropping part. Not just that the former president is at the center of these alleged actions, but what was in those documents and how much risk we were potentially put in.
Let's bring Catherine Herridge back in for a second, because you're raising some really interesting points, Jessica, about what you feel is potentially the most serious issues for the Trump defense team. Catherine, I want to ask you, when you speak to people on the defense team, or when you speak to Donald Trump supporters, and you raise this question about the seriousness of charges specifically related to how this might affect not only relationships with other countries, but the disclosure of our own most serious national security secrets. What do you hear from both the legal team of former President Trump and supporters about exactly this issue that Jessica and you have both raised?
Well, Jim, based on my reporting and speaking with folks who are still very close to the former president, when the indictment was unsealed, that they were somewhat shocked at the detail that was in that indictment and the severity of the allegations, especially when it came to the highly classified information. I know the information can be confusing, but the bottom line for folks at home is that top secret and the compartments associated with top secret, if they are disclosed, the expectation of the U.S. intelligence community is what they call exceptionally grave damage to national security. That means sources like human spies at the CIA are taken off the map, or methods of collection, such as spy satellites in the sky. These are diminished in some way with our adversaries. So privately, I heard a lot of concern about the classification of the records, the detail in the indictment, and it seemed to have a disconnect from what they had heard from people in the Trump camp. So I found that pretty significant. When it comes to these notes with his attorney, Evan Corcoran, we have sections of that transcript in the indictment. Someone who has read the entire transcript said to me to have more of a wait-and-see attitude, that there's a lot more to the conversation than is in the indictment. And they argued pretty strenuously that it feels like a conversation with a defendant asking his attorney what are the left and right boundaries of complying with the subpoena. And based on my reporting, there is a reference in the subpoena, in the transcript, to the Hillary Clinton emails and how her attorney kind of navigated that process. So we're operating at a disadvantage because we can't, and I know you would want to do this as much as I do, you can't independently review the transcript. You can't independently review the audio tape at this point. But in the course of this prosecution and the discovery, hopefully we'll be able to do that independently and see sort of which side of the story has more weight, the indictment or the view of people close to President Trump, that these comments and these parts of the transcript are somewhat out of context in this case.
You know, I want to bring in Jessica and talk about something, legally in a way kind of basic. We continue to hear from the people who stand behind former President Donald Trump that the DOJ, the Department of Justice, has been weaponized. There is this aura of politics around this in a similar way as we heard when he was arraigned last time. That was a state case. This is a federal case. I wonder, what do the politics around all of this do to people's understanding, trust of our federal institutions, given that questioning these charges, despite how much evidence is being presented, really undermines that trust? The Department of Justice, the FBI have been suffering that kind of crisis of legitimacy from Republicans since Trump or the Mar-a-Lago place was so-called raided, as they called it.
It's such an important question, in part because our faith in our institutions really has been so heavily eroded, not just over the last 5 or 6 years, but even longer than that. And I think in part because the problem is the Department of Justice and the attorney general, who was appointed by the current president, who's running for re-election, just indicted the former president, who's running against the current president, who's running against their political opponents. And so that sentence just feels to people like this must be political. But if you look at all the layers here, this is why I think people still should have some faith in the system, because this wasn't President Biden walking into a federal courthouse and saying, you know what would be really helpful for me politically? If we could indict my likely opponent, the former president. What happens, of course, is that every attorney general is politically appointed. If we're not comfortable with that, we need to find a different way to select the attorney general. So the attorney general is politically appointed, but he has so many career Department of Justice prosecutors who work for him or her. Now, what happens in this case, it's not Merrick Garland directly overseeing this particular case. That's in part because the question you asked me about the integrity, about the political optics, that's why we have a special counsel, Jack Smith, to be even one more step removed from the politics. And then let's remember that it wasn't Jack Smith saying, let's indict. It's Jack Smith going to a panel of citizens, going to the grand jury and saying, here's what I found. Is there enough to indict? So I understand how it looks if you read the headline, but I really want to encourage people to go through what we just talked, all the layers of removal from President Biden to the grand jury. And then, of course, we have to allow the criminal justice process as much as possible to play out. We have to reserve judgment with respect to the judge and have faith that those members of the jury, as we talked about, can do their job. Pardon me.
Jessica, thank you. Catherine, we are now just a couple of minutes away from what we were told will be the beginning of the arraignment of a former president of the United States. Obviously, we are dealing with history right now. I'm just wondering, as we close in, what is striking you, Catherine, about this unprecedented situation that not just Donald Trump finds himself in, but the entire country finds itself in as we draw closer?
Well, Jim, none of us have ever been here before. Not the FBI, not the Justice Department, not the federal courts. The criminal indictment of a former president who is seeking his party's nomination for an upcoming federal election. And what we see is the complexity of this case and this intersection with politics. But at the end of the day, we see some processes which are operating in a way that they always would traditionally. A few minutes from enter that federal courthouse behind me like any other criminal defendant with the presumption of innocence. He will be processed by the U.S. Marshals. He will be fingerprinted. He may have his DNA test taken as well. And then there will be a very brief court appearance. He will have the option to have the charges read. Most defendants waive that right. And then he may be asked to enter a plea. His spokesperson told CBS News a short time ago that he will enter a plea of not guilty. And then our legal process will start to manifest itself in the way that it has for decades. The defense will have an opportunity to try and exclude evidence. The spokesperson indicated to CBS News that they would move pretty quickly with motions to dismiss. They believe that there has been prosecutorial misconduct in this case, and the government will have their chance to respond as well, Jim.
Thank you. Thank you so much to our team, Catherine Herridge, Jessica Levinson, Meg Oliver, Manuel Bojorquez, Rob Costa, and Finn Gomez.
We now want to hand it over to CBS News for our special report.
This is a CBS News special report. I'm Nora O'Donnell in Miami, where we are about to witness an unprecedented moment in American history. Former President Donald Trump has just arrived here at this federal courthouse behind me to face 37 counts. He is charged by the special counsel of putting America's national security at risk by allegedly mishandling classified documents and participating in a conspiracy to cover that up. He will be joined by two of his lawyers, Todd Blanche and Chris Kise. The classified documents were stored in a bathroom, a shower, and a bedroom at Mar-a-Lago include information regarding national defense and weapons capabilities of both the United States and foreign countries. And those documents, according to the indictment, detail U.S. nuclear programs as well as potential vulnerabilities of the U.S. and its allies. Also in the indictment, it says that the unauthorized disclosure of these classified documents could put at risk the national security of the United States. Now, we should note, too, that at the 11th hour, the chief judge for the Southern District of Florida issued an order prohibiting journalists from bringing any phones or any electronic devices inside the courthouse for today's arraignment. But we do have reporters in there, and we might hear from them later. You can see lots of protesters here, supporters as well, security tight around the courthouse with federal, state, and local law enforcement officials on alert for protests. You can probably even hear the helicopters above me. Trump's team says that he will plead not guilty today. They're also saying he is never going to quit the presidential race, even if convicted. Trump woke up at his Doral Golf Club this afternoon. He motorcaded right here to the courthouse. His advisors predict that the GOP frontrunner will get a boost after today as he continues to raise money. Chief election and campaign correspondent Robert Costa is right outside the courthouse here in Miami. And Robert, I know you've done some reporting about what the former president was doing this morning. What can you tell us?
Good to be with you, Nora. While former President Trump has been focused on a political battle running for president again for months, last night he met with his lawyers at his nearby resort talking through the next steps in this legal battle. And they believe this could be a protracted fight. But he's scrambling to try to expand his legal team. Two of his attorneys left the legal operation last week. He's trying to bring in some veteran criminal defense lawyers to bolster his ranks as he faces down the special counsel.
Robert, why is he having so much trouble assembling a legal team?
There is a lot of consternation in Trump's inner circle about how exactly to handle this. But Trump is adamant, Nora, behind the scenes, that he wants to fight this at every turn. There's going to be no plea agreement based on what we're hearing. And he is going to push his lawyers to have what are called pre-trial motions before this ever gets to trial, to make sure the judge is aware that they believe the evidence compiled in this case has faults, and they want to try to get this case dismissed. But our sources close to the Justice Department say special counsel Jack Smith is a tough operator, and he's not going to back down. That's why he issued such a sweeping indictment to go in detail about what they found with this evidence, but also on obstruction, where they believe Trump conspired with some of his associates, including Walt Nauta, his body aide, his longtime valet, to try to keep the government from securing these documents at a crucial period when perhaps sources and methods might have been at risk.
Robert Costa, stay with us. I want to bring in CBS senior investigative correspondent Catherine Herridge, who spoke to one of Trump's attorneys earlier today. And Catherine, what have you learned?
Well, Nora, a short time ago, I spoke with Alina Habba. She is a spokesperson and attorney for former President Trump. She handles these civil cases. This was her only network interview, and she spoke with CBS News. She confirmed to me that the former president understands the serious nature of the criminal charges against him and that he and his legal team are ready for a fight. She said that they see this indictment as a selective prosecution that was politically motivated, and she said that it amounted to election interference to frustrate his efforts to seek the party's nomination and, in their view, secure the White House for a second term. But then I pressed her on the fact that this is a very detailed indictment. There are 31 counts for the willful retention of national defense information at the highest levels, as as well as an audio tape where the former president apparently acknowledges that he has a highly classified Pentagon memo about Iran, and he shares it with people, and he admits that he can no longer declassify it. And when she referred to that tape, as well as his lawyer notes, she said, this is only one side of the story. It needs more context. And she said that in their efforts, either through motions to dismiss or discovery, they will show what they believe has been a very one-sided prosecution of the former president, Nora.
Catherine Herridge with that new information. Thank you so much. I'm joined here by Chief National Affairs and Justice Correspondent Jeff DeGaze and Chief Political Analyst John Dickerson. Good to have both of you here as we are just outside the courthouse. Donald Trump has entered to surrender and be arraigned. And John, this is quite a moment in history. It's quite a scene here, but also there's a historical significance.
And they're connected, Nora. This is historical, not just because it's a first, but historical moments ripple with consequences well into the future, and the first consequence will be in law. What's going on right now, whenever politics and law clash, there's always a tension. But because they're both places where fighting takes place. But politics is the fighting of the bar room, and the law is more like a boxing match. There are some rules. The noise you hear today is symbolic of this question of whether the noise of the rally and those who are chanting filters into the law room. That's one of the ripples that will come out from this if after today, going forward in this case. And the other test, of course, is politics, because this happens in a political context where people in public life will perhaps talk about undermining the judicial system. They will, if they don't like the outcome, they will perhaps encourage violence or encourage behavior outside the system. So it is a test of the way people with responsible voices handle this law case in the middle of a political season.
Jeff DeGaze is also with us. And Jeff, security pretty tight around here. What are you hearing this morning in terms of the threat matrix?
Generally speaking, it is tight. However, just being up here and listening to the crowds down on the ground, I think law enforcement might be wondering if they have enough manpower in place, if they have enough physical barriers in place, because driving up here, I did not see a lot of barricades, and now you see these crowds. You hear them chanting, and the crowds are getting bigger. They're sort of surrounding the building. The question throughout the afternoon will be, is there enough law enforcement in place? Although security is tight. Is it tight enough?
Mm-hmm. We know that Trump will appear before a magistrate in a ceremonial courtroom, essentially on the 13th floor, which is just about right across from where we are, right from our vantage point. An extraordinary moment. But because this is a federal courthouse, John, no cameras inside. Even our reporters that are in an overflow room don't have their cell phone, but they will be able to witness it, and we will be able to get a report after our own Scott McFarlane inside to give us those details. But right now, no media in terms of a live feed coming out.
No media. And again, this conflict between Donald Trump and the theater of politics, he's changed the theater of politics in our lifetime. And yet this is taking place, no cameras, trying to squeeze out as much of the chaos of politics from this proceeding. The question is, will that be able to be the case going forward?
We are so spoiled by technology. As you know, our colleagues, 50, 60 years ago, they would have to go to a courtroom and they would describe, or they were on a rooftop and they would describe. But we, as a generation, we're so spoiled seeing pictures in a courtroom. Yes, in a federal courtroom, you're not going to get that. You're going to get sketches like this.
All right. And let's go through that, Jeff. Okay, will there be a mugshot of the former president?
No mugshot.
Okay. What about a DNA sample?
A DNA sample, they will do.
I understand there'll be a swabbing of that. What about fingerprints?
Fingerprints, they will do.
And we understand that Donald Trump will plead not guilty today.
Yeah, he says he's not going to make a speech in the courtroom or speech outside, but just not guilty is what he is expected to say. Short and sweet. speed, but obviously he's unpredictable. So we'll see.
We are going to dig into not only the historical significance of today, but also the legal implications and perhaps the new Trump legal strategy, what it may be, even as he is scrambling to put together a legal team at this moment. But for now, let's bring in Meg Oliver, because she is outside the courthouse with us too, where all the Trump supporters have gathered. Meg?
Yeah, Nora, it is quite a spectacle out here on the ground in front of the courthouse. As you can see, several hundred Trump supporters have turned out. They're waving flags, they're chanting USA and Go Trump. And as you can see, there's also a lot of media, probably more media than Trump supporters. There are also protesters. I talked to one woman who traveled all the way in from New York City. There are people with signs saying, lock him up. And the crowds are continuing to build. We have been watching cars streaming in here. None of the roads are blocked off, Nora. And as you can see, there are just more cars. They're beeping. People are taking pictures outside. And as also you can see, an increased security presence on the ground, by bike, and there are several police cars that are blockading around the federal courthouse. However, multiple federal sources have told CBS News they are concerned about the security situation. If this crowd continues to grow, and we know there are 4 more chartered buses on the way from Orlando with another 200 people expected to join this crowd, they are very concerned of keeping this crowd in control. There's only yellow tape bordering and protecting some portions of this building. So we will continue to see how many people show up here. But Nora, it has been peaceful all day long.
Meg Oliver with the protesters outside the courthouse here. And John, we have been pouring through this indictment since Friday when it came down, and the former president was informed. He was at his Bedminster estate in New Jersey, got the word at about 7 o'clock that he had been indicted. It has been a weekend of going through this and a lot of analysis about what the president is accused of. Jack Smith is the special counsel, Harvard-trained lawyer, triathlete, by all accounts, a pretty determined guy, and by all legal experts who've read this said it's a pretty tough document. Even the former Attorney General, Bill Barr, saying it's very, very detailed. What does Donald Trump face?
He faces a couple of big problems. One is that it's detailed not only in the specifics of the claims that it makes, but the sources for those claims. It includes a transcript of his own voice, the former president's own voice, saying things that undermine one of his defenses, which is that he declassified everything. But they have a transcript of him saying this hasn't been declassified. It also has texts from employees within Mar-a-Lago talking about the movement of documents. Why does that matter? Because the assertion in the indictment is that the president orchestrated. This was not done by some lawyer, not done by some clerk. This was the president moving the boxes one step ahead of those who are trying to enforce the subpoena. So it has contemporaneous texts. It also appears to have taken time codes from the closed-circuit TV inside of Mar-a-Lago that show the president's aides moving the boxes at specific times, linked up with conversations with the president, again, drawing that link between the president's intent to hold on to this material and the movement of the boxes. So it almost reads like a narrative story as the president, between the time he gets the subpoena and when the FBI finally comes to get to the boxes themselves, his efforts to hide the fact he had these documents from the authorities. And the detail and the source of the detail is what makes this such a tough indictment.
The obstruction. And I do want to just detail and remind everybody what those specific charges are. They were announced 5 days ago on Thursday night. I misspoke earlier. Forgive me for that. And the indictment was unsealed a day later, which is when we got, of course, to look at it. 37 counts. These are federal charges. Let's review some of the counts in the indictment. 1 through 31 is willful retention of national defense information. Count 32, the conspiracy to obstruct justice. Count 33, withholding a document or record. Count 34, corruptly concealing a document or a record. Count 35, concealing a document in a federal investigation. we're sort of, it sounds like I'm repeating myself, but there's a reason for this that's detailed if you read through the indictment. Count 36, scheme to conceal. Count 37, false statements and representations. And in particular, those false statements and representations, I think, which are also of note. So even after the archives had asked for the documents and some were turned over, then even after there was a subpoena to go and get those documents, there was then an affidavit by Trump's attorneys, right, that swore to the fact that everything had been turned over. And then lo and behold, a search warrant and even more documents found, a continued series of alleged obstruction by the U.S. government against Donald Trump.
And if I could just break off one piece of that instruction, they are referred to as lawyers 1, 2, and 3. Lawyers 1 and 2 are managing the subpoena and the moving of the documents, and lawyer 1 is supposed to look into the documents. Then, and all that noise you hear behind us is that conflict between the noise of the rally and the quiet of the courtroom. That lawyer number 3 is there is an orchestrated, according to the indictment, effort to make.
And we understand that the booking process is complete. We want to hear now from Trump attorney and spokeswoman Alina Habba.
It is not about the 2024 election. It is about the destruction of the long-standing American principles that have set this country apart for so long. In recent years, we have seen the rise of politically motivated prosecutors who don't care for impartiality, who don't care for due process or equal protection of laws. They have been quietly but aggressively cultivating a two-tiered system of justice where selective treatment is the norm. From the Russia hoax to the attorney generals to the corrupt DAs in Georgia and New York, and now this. The people in charge of this country do not love America. They hate Donald Trump. What we are witnessing today is the blatant and unapologetic weaponization of the criminal justice system. The Biden-appointed special counsel has sought fit to bring 37 federal charges against President Trump, the leading frontrunner, less than a year and a half before an election. Countless other individuals, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden himself, retained possession of classified documents that have not been prosecuted. And none of them came into possession of those documents while they were president. None of them were president who, as the head and sole member of the executive branch, has the power to summarily declassify documents. The decision to pursue charges against President Trump while turning a blind eye to others is emblematic of the corruption that we have here. We are at a turning point in our nation's history. The targeting, prosecution of a leading political opponent is the type of thing you see in dictatorships like Cuba and Venezuela. It is commonplace there for rival candidates to be prosecuted, persecuted, and put into jail. What is being done to the President Trump should terrify all citizens of this country. These are not the ideals that our democracy is founded upon. This is not our America. Thank you.
So what's happening right now inside the courthouse? Has he been arrested? Has he been fingerprinted? Has a mugshot been taken? Walk us through what's happening here now.
President Trump is in a very unique position where he doesn't need to be given a mugshot, obviously. He's not a flight risk. He is the leading candidate of the GOP at the moment. He is going through a process that has been coordinated with Secret Service, and it will all be handled seamlessly.
And the attorneys, what is his statement? Just real quick, how is he feeling?
He's defiant.
And there we have Trump's attorney and spokesperson, Alina Habba. Let's just break down a little bit what she said, John.
Well, it's what she didn't say that strikes me. What she didn't say is my client didn't do any of the things alleged in all of those detailed accounts. She didn't say any of that. She went way over to the political realm, which is not unfamiliar for former President Trump. He's done that before. But, Robert Hur, who's the special counsel looking into Joe Biden's, President Biden's classified documents, he'd be surprised to know that he's not investigating President Biden. So even what she said about President Biden was factually incorrect. But most importantly, she said nothing about her client's innocence on the charges of obstruction. She did address the idea of a blanket declassification, which, as we talked about earlier, the former president undermines in his own statements.
Yeah, that message was music to the ears of Trump supporters. Even here in South Florida, you heard her refer to Cuba and Venezuela. There's so much history in South Florida as it relates to those two countries. There are a lot of exiles who live here. And so whenever you compare the U.S. to Cuba or Venezuela under Chavez or Cuba under Castro, you're sending a message to the people out here protesting, the honking of the horns, the chanting here. They are here for Donald Trump, and to hear that message, it's right down their alley because it says, oh, he's being treated differently. This isn't a democracy. Well, if you look at that case, and I've said this over and over again, as you know, investigators gave the former president every opportunity to turn over all the documents.
And John, but isn't the opposite true? That actually the difference between the United States and Cuba and Venezuela is that no one is above the law in the United States, not even a former president of the United States.
That's precisely right. And that the standard is the same. And so presumably the independent counsel who is investigating the sitting president is using the same standard as the one being applied to the former president. And so that's exactly right. And we should note, by the way, that the former Attorney General, Bill Barr, came out this weekend and said to these questions of weaponization, he said, I defend the president on Russiagate. I stood up and called out Alvin Bragg, that's the Manhattan District Attorney, and I've spoken out for 30 years about the abuse of the criminal justice process to influence politics. He said, though, about weaponization in this case, it is simply not true. That is a former Trump ally and a former Attorney General weighing in on precisely the charges his defense lawyer was making about weaponization.
I'm sorry.
Let's dig into that particular point that was made by the Trump attorney with Catherine Herridge, because it has been brought up repeatedly about the difference between now a federal criminal prosecution against Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton's emails. That was the difference is one between willfulness and obstruction, correct?
When you look at the case of when you look at the case of then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, Nora, that was an FBI investigation back in 2016. So again, during an election cycle. Just to remind, then Secretary of State Clinton used a personal server for her government email and for government business. And the FBI investigation found dozens of email chains containing classified information, some at the highest levels, like what has been allegedly found at Mar-a-Lago, including what are called special access programs. These are highly classified programs that in some cases the government doesn't even acknowledge that they exist. In 2016, then FBI Director James Comey said that Clinton and her team, these are his words, were extremely careless, and that he did not find evidence, in his view, of criminal intent or willfulness. Those are the key words here, and I think that's why Special Counsel Jack Smith specifically charges, in the case of former President Donald Trump, the willful retention of national defense information. So what does that mean for a layperson? It means you have highly classified information, and the allegation is that you refuse to return it to the government, even though it's the government's property. So to break down the cases in the simplest terms, it would come down to this issue of intent.
Willfulness and obstruction. And Catherine, you laid it out so clearly in that point about why these cases are are different in terms of why federal charges were brought against Donald Trump. Also want to bring in our CBS News legal analyst, Ricky Kleeman, who is following this along with us. And Ricky, you know this indictment in and out. What are the most difficult, or what is really, let's say this, what's the next step? What can Trump's attorneys do?
Well, I think that's exactly the right question, Nora. And we learned a lot in the statements of Alina Habba, because you cannot defend the indefensible. This indictment is so detailed and so backed up by real evidence, by the text messages, by the movement of the boxes, by the matter on tape. So what the defense must do is fight the government on motion practice. And that means they are going to file various motions to dismiss. We got it right from her. They're going to file a motion to dismiss for selective prosecution, which they will say is a denial of due process. She was very interesting to me because of looking at the law. One of the things that she said was that none of the documents were with the other people that she was talking about, having to do with President Biden, having to do with Hillary Clinton, that none of their documents did they get when they were president. And where that is leading ultimately, Nora, is that one of the motions to dismiss is clear to me is going to be based on the Presidential Records Act, because that was a civil penalty. That's how the act reads. And it is passed decades after the Espionage Act, which goes to the retention of the documents. So they are going to try to say that this should have been handled as a civil matter. And they're going to go back and look at the other Clinton. They're going to go back and look at an opinion having to do with Bill Clinton and his storing of tapes after he was president. As they say, the storage is the sock drawer. And he got to keep those tapes as personal records. And there is this unique power of the presidency to decide in the end what is personal and what is not. Understanding, of course, here the addition is that there is alleged obstruction.
Okay, Ricky, that's one point. I understand you're saying that the president's attorneys will come forward and say he can keep these classified materials under the Presidential Records Act. But the National Archives came out and said this is not true. All records have to be turned over. And by the way, there is no you get 60 days after you leave the presidency. You have to have it done before you actually leave the White House. The rules are clear. Bush followed the rules. Obama followed the rules. In the case of Biden, there were some documents that were not, that ended up in his, they were turned back over. Pence, he had some, they were turned back over. There's no ambiguity about what the Presidential Records Act says.
And another person who's weighed in on that question is
Bill Barr.
Attorney General Bill Barr, who said he in no way had a right to these records. If he were to claim that there was a personal letter, you can have a debate about that if it's highly personal, but not these kinds of records, which are the property of the United States.
Let's keep going through some of these ways that I think Trump attorneys are going to try to argue this case. But first, I want to bring in our chief campaign correspondent, Robert Costa, because he's outside the courthouse in Miami. He's done such incredible reporting on this. And really, maybe even before the Trump team can make their counter argument, they have to come up with a team, right? Why are they still scrambling to put together a team for the former president of the United States? What's gone on?
Nora, when you step back and look at the past 10 days or so, the past 10 days have been effectively a century for the Trump legal team. They have had so much upheaval. It was just a few Mondays ago they went to the Justice Department, two lawyers, Jim Trusty and John Rowley, and had a meeting with the special counsel explaining their concerns. Yet just days later, the indictment's unsealed. It gets very real. Then those lawyers leave the legal team. Now Trump trying to bring on new people, but it's complicated for the former president. president because he's here in Florida. Many lawyers are not able to practice necessarily in federal court in Florida unless they're really granted approval to do so. It's much different in Washington, where it seems like a lawyer is on every street corner going down K Street. And so now you have a former president meeting with his team, expressing so much grievance behind the scenes. Last night at Doral, on his campaign plane, we're told, talking to friends on the phone. But when it comes to a legal strategy, yes, fighting can be one. But at the end of the day, the special counsel and the federal judge are not always predictable. Now, the Trump camp is hoping that Judge Eileen Cannon, a Trump appointee, will end up overseeing this case in the coming months. And something to pay attention to now is, when does Judge Cannon, if it does end up being her as we expect, when does she set the next meeting for Trump or his lawyers to come before the court? The special counsel has asked for a speedy trial because of what's all swirling around this case. But if the judge says we're only going to meet in a month or two, that means this could be a protracted process that takes the former president deep into the campaign next year. He could be having court appearances in New York, in Georgia, if he's indicted there, here in Florida, all while he's running for the nomination in places like Iowa and New Hampshire.
Robert, is it possible that the former president is having trouble hiring some new lawyers because he's dismissed so many in the past, or so many have resigned?
When you look at former President Trump's career, there have always been high-profile, controversial advisors and often attorneys. Think about Roy Cohn, who was at Trump's side in the 70s and 80s before he died. Then there was Michael Cohen, his longtime fixer. But Trump, as much as he wants television lawyers, people who can be brash brawlers in television appearances with the press, he also needs veteran defense attorneys, often with his real estate years, but now with a criminal trial, who take this seriously, who know the law. Because when you're dealing with the special counsel, it's not like sparring in a green room or on a television show. You have to really know the law on a federal level, on a criminal level. And if you're that kind of lawyer, you're going to probably take some pause before you sign on to this kind of case. Though Todd Blanche, one of the more respected lawyers in this area, he has signed on with Trump, and he has left his firm, a prominent firm. So Trump is now, we're told by many sources, telling Todd Blanche, who's very low-key, doesn't go on TV, to be a killer for him, Trump's words behind the scenes, and try to sew this up for him legally.
Robert Costa, thank you. And just to let everyone know, former President Donald Trump is inside this courtroom right behind me, this federal courthouse. He has been booked for 37 federal counts against the former president of the United States. He is the only current or former president who has faced federal charges of this kind. The special counsel alleging that what Donald Trump did put national security at risk. Jeff Pegues was actually near the special counsel Jack Smith last night. Tell us about that.
Quite unexpectedly, I was flying down to Miami, and I was at the airport in D.C. and noticed this guy with his beard walking up. If you've seen a photograph of him or video of him, there he is. I think that's my video. If you see a photograph of him, you see that distinctive beard. What else I noticed is that no one recognized him except me. You know, here is the guy tasked with taking on a former president. Nobody right now knows who he is. In fact, I heard somebody in the crowd say, "Oh, I think that's one of Donald Trump's attorneys." And I sort of chuckled. But he's all business. He is all business.
And did you also notice, because just this weekend, Donald Trump called him a deranged psycho, this federal attorney, this special counsel who's worked for the government, has prosecuted war criminals. He had a lot of security around him.
He had some security, but he seemed off to himself. He was sitting a few rows back, just behind the exit row in a little window seat. The plane was packed. You know, you'd think that the DOJ would have some special jet to send him down on, but no, he flew commercial like the rest of us.
Well, as Gayle King always says, stars, they're just like us. But in this case, special counsels, they're just like us. They fly,
that's right.
And in this case, fly commercial. And he was in economy class?
He was in economy class with the rest of us, but he didn't smile. I didn't see him smile at all.
These are very serious charges, no doubt, that he is bringing against us. And I want to ask you, too, about, John, because right now the president inside, we will never get pictures of what happened inside, but it is a moment to go from being the president of the United States, the leader of the free world, to have to stand before a magistrate and hear these charges and then plead not guilty and think about. And he has escaped accountability in the past and believes he is the focus of political persecution. But this is distinct.
It is distinct, and also it's distinct with respect to all the previous clashes Donald Trump has had, either with the impeachments or with anything else, because he always asserted that he never did anything wrong. But the behavior contained in this indictment is the behavior of a person running around authorities. There is detailed accounts of him knowing that, according to the indictment, and the details seem to spell this out, knowing that he is doing something that he's not supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
And so if he carries that into the courtroom with him, he's got to have a deeper, one would imagine, sense of his own peril in this instance than in previous ones.
As you pointed out, your analysis from reading this indictment, Donald Trump refers to them as my boxes, even though they are presidential records and they are government documents. He refers to them in the context when he calls them my boxes. He didn't even want his personal aide to show them to his attorney.
That's right.
Corcoran.
That's right. He didn't, and when he says, "I don't want you going through my boxes, I really don't," is one of the quotes contained in the indictment. And that was to go through the boxes for the purposes of complying with a subpoena. This gets to the obstruction question. And that was one of 5 instances in which the president, according to the indictment, orchestrated activity to thwart the federal authorities looking for these documents, which he did not have the right to have.
I want to bring in now Timothy Parlatore. He served as a Trump attorney but left due to differences with Trump advisor Boris Epstein. Mr. Parlatore joins us now, and good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. So have you spoken with any of the former president's attorneys about their strategy to defend him? What's next?
I have not spoken with any of the current team about this. You know, my tenure on the legal team ended in about a month ago, and certainly I remain close with John Rowley and Jim Trusty, but I'm not in contact with the current team.
Tim, do you know? I mean, how many different attorneys has Donald Trump had recently, and how many of them resigned, and why?
Well, look, he has a lot of different attorneys because he has a lot of different cases. And, I can't really speak for anybody else. I have my reasons, which I did discuss at the time that I left. It's not something I really want to, belabor. It's difficult to represent a client in a case like this when there are other influences at play. So that's why I felt that it was best for me to leave. And certainly I hope that he will find the team that can properly defend him in this case.
No doubt you have read through all 49 pages of this indictment and looked closely at some of the evidence in this indictment. The former Attorney General, Bill Barr, calls this a very, very damning indictment. Is he wrong?
Well, I think that the problem is you look at the indictment and if you just read it by itself and you assume that everything in it is true and you kind of ignore a lot of the conduct of the DOJ team in getting to this point, it can look that way. However, as a criminal defense attorney, one of the things that I do for a living is I take documents like this, I look at them a little bit more skeptically, I then go through the evidence to see if it actually matches up. And oftentimes it doesn't. DOJ oftentimes will bring indictments where by the time we get to discovery, we realize these aren't true. Or they're certainly not as airtight. Maybe there are 30 witnesses that say something one way, a couple that say something the other way, and they'll just write what some of the witnesses said instead of the rest.
Okay, well,
so
Tim, what specifically?
Just because it looks damning.
Specifically.
The thing that jumped out to me specifically is kind of the big hurdle that they're going to have to overcome is the exchange between Trump and Walt Nauta before Evan did his search, which they claim is based on all these video surveillance and phone records. And if that's true, then that's a pretty big hurdle. But at the same time, if that's true, then it's something that they would have used before now to try and convince Walt Nauta to change his story. And so the kind of the manner in which the investigation was conducted surrounding that undermines the credibility of that.
All right, I understand your point, but I'm not sure that the body man or the personal aide or the valet is central to this case. I think some of the most damning evidence comes from Trump's former attorney, Evan Corcoran. And so on that note, I wonder, because as you know, the crime fraud exception was used, granted by a federal judge, to pierce the attorney-client privilege, which then allowed the notes and voice
correct. But I do think that there are some questions. Her prior conduct, not in this particular case, but a predecessor dispute where Trump filed a civil lawsuit trying to object to the FBI's seizure of these documents. And her rulings in that case were really striking in how solicitous of and protective of the former president they were. And she was rebuked pretty sharply by a panel of the very conservative 11th Circuit. So I think that we're going to have to wait and see what her disposition is here. But a lot is going to turn on her when we're kind of trying to think about what the calendar might look like.
And you touched on this here a moment ago. In addition to the calendar, because she'll hear the case made by Jack Smith to move this along as quickly as possible so that the American people can then decide for themselves with whatever a jury finds in the end. You'll have Donald Trump's team, we presume here, that will make the case to move more slowly, right? And as he tries to get elected president for a second time. But in the middle there, as this plays out, she'll also play a major role, obviously, in deciding which evidence is presented to that jury.
Which evidence? And there are all these hard questions about classified information and how you try a case where these classified documents are so central. So there's a federal statute called the Classified Information Procedures Act that sets forth these procedures so that you can basically give defendants the right to see and respond to the documents, but also protect the secrets in those documents. And that's usually really time consuming. And so I got to imagine that DOJ, these special counsel prosecutors, are trying to figure out if some of these documents could just be declassified so that you can sort of circumvent all of those complex procedures. They've got 31 documents, so maybe some of them they decide to abandon, or even if some get suppressed, they have a number they can still go forward with. But there's going to be a lot of activity around those questions, how you try this case in a way that protects national security, but also the constitutional right to mount a real defense.
You said something, Dan, while we were on the air last week that got a lot of attention. You said Donald Trump will clearly try to slow down the timeline here. He'll try to get elected president for a second time, and he'll make this go away.
Yeah. I mean, look, if this case isn't finished by the time that Donald Trump is elected, I don't think it's any question that he can figure out a way to make it go away. This federal case, as distinguished from New York and Georgia, which are state cases. And as a result, if you're Donald Trump, why do you want a public hearing, which is a lot of it is going to be bad? I mean, even if he's got strong defenses, a lot of the allegations are going to be negative. They're going to be ugly and embarrassing. Why do you want that? And more importantly, why do you want to potentially leave it up to a jury as to whether he gets convicted when he could wait until the election, hope he gets elected, and then figure out a way to get rid of the case?
So is there really any debate about the timeline strategy on the side of Donald Trump here?
No, there's none. I mean, Donald Trump will say he wants to move this case as quickly as possible, right? That's not just Donald Trump. Defendants, their lawyers always claim, A, that their client wants to testify, and B, that they want to get the case to trial as quickly as possible. And a lot of the time, neither one are true. But you see it in case after case. So you're going to see him saying that he wants to have it quick, but there's no doubt that he's going to want to try and slow roll this. And that's where Kate's absolutely right, where the judge is going to have enormous power there. I mean, the judge doesn't actually decide the verdict, but as a legal matter, the judge could even dismiss the charges. The judge could at some point, the defense could say, we'd like to make a motion after the prosecution's evidence is in, and the judge can dismiss the case as a matter of law. So that's the sort of worst case scenario for Jack Smith. But up until that point, she's going to have enormous power, jury selection, deciding which jurors can make it onto the jury, which ones don't, the timing, which evidence comes in, which doesn't, a lot of critical issues.
You know, when we've covered Donald Trump long before he became president in this country, and he's famous for this in all of the legal threats and peril along the way, stall tactics, delaying. And again, we can't overstate that delaying in this case, in this particular case, is very, very significant. He faces the biggest legal peril of his life right now. That we're talking about potential prison time here, and we can get into the conversation about whether a Republican or even a Democratic president would pardon him one day. But I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves here. But of course, he would want to slow down this timeline and work even harder to become president.
Right. He's a great litigant. I mean, he's been involved in a lot of litigation. He knows how to do this stuff. He's not a great client, but he's a great litigant. And so he knows this game, not necessarily with regard to criminal charges, it's in the civil context. But I think he's going to be leading that effort to delay, because that delay is not just a legal decision. It goes back to Jonathan's point. It's an intersection of politics and law. He's got to think about, where are we going to be in the campaign? Is there any political advantage to having this out there? And I can't see a single political advantage to him in having this case tried before the election.
Preet Bharara, do you agree with that?
Yeah, completely, 100%. And further to what Dan has been saying, there may be all sorts of ideas that Donald Trump has in his head, including the idea with respect to any federal charges, the one that we are now talking about today, and maybe a future one with respect to January 6th, that he can appoint an attorney general and other leadership at the Department of Justice to reach down, and if the case is not yet concluded, get rid of the case. I mean, this is one of the criticisms that a lot of people made of Bill Barr with respect to the sentencing of Roger Stone and with respect to the involvement in the case with respect to that general, right? Just get a new person in charge to replace Merrick Garland and have that person do my bidding. And we know in a second Trump term, he's going to have all sorts of stooges at the heads of these agencies. And the other thing he might be thinking about, which I think is a long shot according to most legal experts, is maybe he becomes president and he thinks he can pardon himself. This issue came up from time to time and was speculated about when he was investigated previously, both with respect to Bob Mueller and some other instances. Most legal scholars think you can't self-pardon, but that's something in Donald Trump's head. So Dan is right. There are a number of ways that machinations in the head of Donald Trump and his legal team might be spinning to figure out how to get out of this bind, so long as you can delay enough to make that happen.
Preet, what do you know about Aileen Cannon, the judge in this case? And obviously, as we've been talking here at the desk about her outsized role in sort of controlling the timeline here, she'll hear cases made on each side here, but her decisions on whether to move quickly or not could determine the entire outcome of what this country then witnesses unfold.
Yeah, so her role is incredibly important. When I was the U.S. attorney and when I was a line assistant, the first question you asked after the grand jury returned an indictment was, who's the judge? And judges are not fungible, and they have different viewpoints. They have different feelings about how evidence should be admitted. They have great control over trials in their courtrooms. Some are more permissive in what kind of evidence they allow in. Some are less. Some move speedily. Some move more slowly. All of those things have great bearing here for the reasons we've been discussing. She may be chastened in some ways because of the shutdown by the 11th Circuit, the conservative 11th Circuit, based on some of the things she's done previously, as Kate was talking about. So there's reason to believe she's going to be probably more deliberate and careful on the motions that'll be made and the applications that'll be made by both parties. But it remains to be seen how she's going to conduct herself in this case. She's not been on the bench that long, so there's not a super long track record to examine and make predictions about.
Preet Bharara with us for our coverage here. You're watching ABC News Live coverage here today of something, and it seems like we say this often, but today we really mean it. This is something this country has not seen before. A former president indicted on federal criminal charges, again, 37 counts. He is inside that courthouse, inside that building, and we have just learned from our team inside the courtroom that he, as of 2:45 here, just a couple of minutes ago, now in the courtroom in front of that federal magistrate judge, Jonathan Goodman, who is presiding over today's proceedings, if you will. Aileen Cannon will then take the case from here. We've been talking a lot about her outsized role in determining how this case proceeds and where it might go from here. But we do know that Donald Trump is inside that courtroom with lawyers on each side, and I presume that is the legal team right now. The two lawyers that we spoke of earlier, John Santucci, you were reporting, as was other members of our team, that last night in the 11th hour, Donald Trump was still working to beef up his legal team here.
Still working to beef up the team, David, continuing those conversations today before heading to court. No full legal team set, so relying on these two attorneys who have been by his side for the last about a year, give or take, in each of their cases. Todd Blanche, who has come in rather late to Team Trump, he was elevated to the lead role on the Manhattan DA's probe. That's the one, the hush money payments to adult film actress Stormy Daniels. Then Chris Kise, who's a known Florida attorney. And that was really important, David, in order to actually be at the table today. We needed one member of Team Trump to be barred by the state Florida Bar Association, and Kise indeed is. Kise at the moment, besides this case, is working on the New York Attorney General's probe into Trump's failure to pay taxes, both for him as an individual and the Trump organization. The goal, though, I'm told, is to expand this team quite significantly, because I think Dan noted this earlier. There really does need to be a team here. There is a lot of information that is known, but also unknown. We need to see a little bit more of what Jack Smith has. That indictment, all 49 pages of it, certainly revealing. But the big concern I heard from Team Trump, and a question actually the former president was asking people as he was calling advisors throughout the weekend, what else do you think they have?
John Santucci reporting on the two lawyers in that room today, Todd Blanche, Chris Kise, and making a very valid point that the American people should keep in mind that both of these lawyers are currently heavily involved in other cases that are playing themselves out in court right now for the former president. Now they add this case, which is his most significant legal hurdle that he faces, not just in this chapter, but really in his lifetime. 37 federal criminal counts today in court. Again, now 250. We know for about 5 minutes now the former president has been in that courtroom. We knew all along that there would not be cameras. This is federal court that we're talking about. We knew that the process might move along a little more quickly than what we witnessed in Lower Manhattan, simply because Donald Trump and his team, though it's still ever changing here, the legal team, did get a chance to read that 49-page indictment well in advance, along with the rest of the American people. The speaking indictment that we have talked about, that Jack Smith put out before the American people late last week. He actually invited the American people to read that indictment, saying that he hoped the American people, no matter where they come to, from which end of the political spectrum, that they'll understand the gravity, was his word, that he used to describe what he believes he and his team found in their investigation of the classified documents at Mar-a-Lago. And again, we've been talking at length here in our coverage about how this case is different from the others, and there ought to be a lot of questions about the other cases involving classified documents. Folks at home are smart to ask those questions, but there are a number of key sort of differentiations here between this case and the others, and they all can be argued. But in this particular case, what Jack Smith is saying is that not only did he have classified documents, but that there were multiple opportunities given to the former president, turn those documents back to the National Archives, back over to federal authorities. Jack Smith alleges that not only did he not do that, but that he was involved in suggesting at one point or another to a lawyer to hide or destroy them, that they were placed all throughout Mar-a-Lago. And we've talked to John Carl extensively, who's been to Mar-a-Lago a number of times to interview the former president, found in the bathroom, the shower, the ballroom, a number of places, and that there is a recording that Jack Smith has as part of this investigation, during which Donald Trump, and of course this is part of the indictment, Donald Trump will, of course, defend himself in criminal court. He has said, I am not guilty. I did nothing wrong here. But there is a recording during which Donald Trump can be heard saying in so many words that I have this document here, describing a document saying I could have declassified it as president. I didn't, and I cannot do it now. And Jack Smith's argument and his team, their argument in that courtroom and before a jury, if it makes it that far, would be therein lies sort of the argument here that Donald Trump was aware of the stakes of the rules and how classified information should be handled. Now, what you're looking at right now are live pictures of the protesters who have gathered there today. And we should take note that there are people there flying Trump flags, supporting the former president. There are also those there saying, lock him up. You see right there in the foreground, a sort of split turnout today. We know that the former president in recent days has asked his supporters to turn out in South Florida to protest what he has repeatedly called a witch hunt before the American people. We took note a short time ago when Alina Habba came forward before the cameras, acting as a spokesperson on this date of history for Donald Trump, and turning to that familiar language, a witch hunt, turning to Joe Biden, to Hillary Clinton, to other cases involving classified documents. And of course, we played some of that for you, as the former president should be allowed to make his defense. But we also took note that in at least that moment, and we'll wait and see how this plays out, but in that moment, there was no defense of what is included in these 49 pages, this indictment from Jack Smith. And of course, we'll wait to see how the lawyers defend the former president once that legal team is put in place. But I think this notion that Todd Blanche and Chris Kise Kate Shaw are standing on each side of the president, the former president, at this hour in South Florida, and that they're already deeply involved in trying to defend Donald Trump in two other cases playing out. And we know there are a multitude of cases that still we don't know where they're going to go. The January 6th investigation, and also we haven't mentioned here at the table the Georgia investigation, where there's the telephone call and Donald Trump says, I just need 11,000 some odd votes here. Help me out. We don't know where they're going to go in the state of Georgia, though we expect those developments could come in the coming weeks, certainly this summer as well.
That's right. The Fulton County prosecutor has basically suggested that July or August, we could see additional charges out of her office. And again, that also involves, efforts essentially to overturn the Georgia presidential election. So a distinct set of charges, state charges like the Manhattan case. So not charges that Trump would be in a position to do anything about, right, if he did manage to attain the presidency again. But I do think that two ongoing criminal cases, two potential additional criminal cases, it really is striking how small the legal team is right now, given the enormous range of sort of legal jeopardy that the former president is in. And, as John Santucci was reporting, it sounds like there is an active effort to get more lawyers on board. And the fact that there aren't more, I think, seems to suggest that it's not going well, right? The team is having a hard time securing additional counsel. And honestly, when you read the indictment, one potential reason might be that the lawyers surrounding the former president themselves are potentially ending up in legal jeopardy, right? So you actually have the former president saying to one of his lawyers, just identified as attorney number one, but seems pretty clearly to have been Evan Corcoran, a former lawyer. Basically, can we ignore the subpoena? Can we say we don't have anything? Later, after some documents are nevertheless located by Corcoran, Trump saying, essentially suggesting maybe plucking some documents out, not explicitly directing destruction, but seeming to hint at it, according to the indictment. And, lawyers reading this, I think, might reasonably worry about what they are exposing themselves to if they join this legal team. We don't know if that's why they're having trouble securing additional counsel, but certainly a possibility.
And John Santucci, I'm struck by something you reported here late last week, and you and I have talked about it off air here, which was the description you learned from your sources on the day Jack Smith came before the cameras. And I think that people in this country, whether you support Trump or whether you don't, people are just curious whether or not the former president knows the kind of legal peril in this moment. Does he recognize this is far different from all of the other legal hurdles that we have reported on in the past year?
He absolutely does, David. And I think in part, it's twofold for Trump on that Friday evening. He started to flip through that indictment in real time. And as I've reported, David, the photos, he was showing them to people saying, well, how did they get this? Who gave them this? Where did this come from? He made comments about the attorneys that he was paying, his team was paying. Why did they talk to them? I think all of that barrage of evidence that Special Counsel Jack Smith had pulled together, all of it weighing on Trump. We all know, being around Donald Trump, a phrase he often used is, what do you think? How is this playing for me? And many people struggling to say that this was good for Donald Trump. One aide telling me it was one of the toughest days they can recall working for the former president. I am told that he indeed watched Special Jack Smith's press conference, taking it all in rather silently. David, watching it all, it was just a matter of a couple of minutes and then quickly getting back on the phones. Yet again, that question, what do you think? How does this play? How do we move this forward? And certainly, David, we know throughout the weekend he has been working the phones asking that question. And as Kate just mentioned, as we've reported, trying to build out more lawyers because even he realizes he needs more help here.
John, we're getting new information as we speak. Thank you, John. Luke Brugman, who's in the courtroom, reporting that Donald Trump has not only been in the courtroom now for about 15 minutes before that federal magistrate, surrounded by 2 attorneys, one on each side of the former president, but at the other table are 2 federal prosecutors, and standing behind them, Pierre Thomas, is Jack Smith, the special counsel.
I had reasons to suspect that he would be there. This case is both personal and professional. Personal in the sense that the FBI agents and the prosecutors who worked on this case were under enormous pressure to do it by the book and to come back with facts that he could use in the case. So that's the personal part. Professional part is, I think it's important to him to send the signal to the troops. I'm with you all the way in a case that we've never seen before. We keep coming back to it, Dave. Donald Trump is the most unique criminal defendant in the history of the country, period. You saw traffic block several lanes, so his motorcade. Most criminal defendants don't go to court with a motorcade. You know, all the system is designed to respect him, even as the case is trying to administer justice in a way that it would for anyone else. It's a fascinating thing we're watching unfold here. The special counsel knows that. His being there is in part to send a signal to all those involved that we've taken this dramatic step. We're going to do it by the book. And my presence here is to indicate that I'm in full support, because there are all kinds of issues about security for these people as well. They've been very direct with us in terms of not putting out the names of some of the investigators, not putting out names of some of the team members. This is all as serious as it gets.
So again, live coverage here at this hour, the former president in South Florida to answer the 37 counts, federal criminal charges. And we have just been told by our reporting team inside the courtroom that not only is the former president there, but Jack Smith, the special counsel, is there too. We know late last week when Jack Smith came before the American people to talk about this 49-page indictment, inviting the American people to read it in its totality. They worked, you could tell, at length to try to make this accessible for people, and not a lot of legal jargon in this indictment, to try to make the case, whether or not you buy into it or not, but at least put out there what they think is damning evidence. You could see the sort of the weight of what he was talking about. He said the gravity of this is laid out in these 49 pages, saying that the former president should be presumed innocent until proven guilty, making sure that the American people understood that he believes in one of the basic tenets of what we're watching unfold as well. But John Santucci, this is significant, this small detail out of the courtroom, the fact that the former president is now face-to-face with Jack Smith. And I'm, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the first time they're in the room together, correct?
It is absolutely the first time they are in the room together. And you know Donald Trump right now, David. We know from that first court appearance he made in Manhattan, I am sure he is sitting rather silently, but I know Donald Trump, he's looking at Jack Smith, probably giving him a head nod, probably trying to find a way to be a little charming in some respect. I can tell you he had with the New York Attorney General Letitia James. At first, he tried that same tactic. That's the Donald Trump charm offense. We know that Donald Trump's first move is to try to be friendly, try to be cordial, even though he has attacked Jack Smith everywhere across social media and at the rallies. It doesn't matter. This is the different Donald Trump. I've often described Donald Trump as several different iterations. One is the brash person that we see out in front of the cameras at the podium, but the other is Donald Trump, the businessman. And I think right now, David, that is the guy that is in the courtroom, looking at Jack Smith, little head nod, hoping some way, maybe they can form a connection. I don't think that's going to happen, though, David.
No, but you're right, John Santucci. We have all covered Donald Trump, and that is what he does. He does that, in a debate, whether it's a primary debate, a presidential debate. If you're the moderator, you'll get a head nod at the beginning of the debate.
I mean, he's called the guy deranged.
And he went after his wife, too.
He went after his wife. I mean, it's been deeply personal the way he's gone after him. But, he went after the judge in New York before walking into that courtroom. and obviously went after Alvin Bragg and his team, and he was utterly silent when faced with them.
We've just learned, John, that Todd Blanche, again, the attorney on one side of Donald Trump, has entered a plea of not guilty. It was Todd Blanche who did it before the federal magistrate, Jonathan Goodman, in that courtroom. We know that the magistrate's handling today's proceedings, and we've talked an awful lot about it. Aileen Cannon, who will take the case from here, a Trump-appointed attorney there in South Florida. But back to this notion, this dynamic between Donald Trump and Jack Smith, and I don't want to belabor it, but I also don't want to diminish the moment. And Pierre, I mean, back during the Mueller investigation, for example, you didn't really see Bob Mueller, but the fact that Jack Smith is standing in that courtroom with Donald Trump signals what?
It's highly unusual. Bob Mueller did not appear at any of the major cases, as far as I can recall. Did not appear. He let the work be done in the court on his behalf. It's the equivalent. The special counsel in a case like this is operating with the power and the authority on some level of the attorney general. It would be like the attorney general, in a case that's brought against some major suspect, suddenly showing up in the court during a criminal trial. You occasionally see top level officials maybe appear before the Supreme Court, but not in a circumstance like this. I think he's sending the signal again that this is a case that he has personally been involved in, that he's monitored it at every step. And as the young people say every now and then, man's got a little swag.
Yeah.
He walked into that press conference on Friday, and we were all waiting to see what's his demeanor. He's never been in a circumstance where millions of people are watching him as he's speaking. And he walked in there and he owned the moment, and he talked very straightforward. And I think it's not lost on him being in the same room with Donald Trump would send a message.
Yeah, and no question that Donald Trump, this is one of his skills, part of the skill set that Donald Trump brings to the table is he sizes up anyone that will be an opponent in some way, right? Somewhere along the way. And you can imagine that Donald Trump would have taken into account immediately, as soon as we learned it was Jack Smith, who Jack Smith is and what his experience is. And as you pointed out earlier, Jack Smith is not only a federal prosecutor, but he's tried crimes on the international level, war crimes.
Right. So, incredibly experienced prosecutor. One thing that, since we learned that Smith is in the courtroom, I have been wondering is, will the team ask this magistrate judge to admonish the former president, the defendant, about his public statements, right? We already, as John just said, he has already disparaged and gone after Smith, his wife. Remember back in April when the arraignment before the Manhattan the Manhattan trial court judge Merchant happened, there was a request, and Merchant granted this request. He said, no divisive rhetoric, right? He sort of essentially, told the president, watch what you say on social media. And I'm very curious if we'll get a similar request today. It'll just, sort of feel different in that the main target of that, rhetoric will be in the courtroom too. So I'm curious if we will learn that such a request was made and what the magistrate judge will say in response.
So it's always a tough balance, right? A defendant should be able, in most cases, to say, I'm innocent, I think I was falsely charged, and even to impugn the credibility and the reputation of the prosecutor bringing the charges. Now, there are cases with gag orders where that is not allowed, but in most cases, the defendant is allowed to speak out. The question becomes, when does it reach that line where it's literally putting people at risk in a case like this? And it's a balance between typically the freedom of speech and the need to have a criminal trial proceed in an orderly and safe fashion.
Dan Abrams and Kate Shaw on this notion that Jack Smith, a special counsel who has been targeted in the public arena by Donald Trump, and not a surprise, and that anyone in a case generally goes after the prosecutor trying them, but not perhaps with this sort of megaphone and as personally. Olivia Rubin from our team reporting moments ago that inside that courtroom, it was Todd Blanche, the attorney to one side of the former president, who pleaded not guilty for the president, entered the not guilty plea, if you will, in that courtroom. And again, we've been painting the picture as we knew we would have to do for you because there are no cameras in federal court. Let's bring it to Aaron Katursky as to what plays out from here, Aaron. So now we know about the not guilty plea entered on behalf of the former president. We know Jack Smith is there. We know two of the attorneys who are right now fighting cases on Donald Trump's behalf in other venues, very different cases. Blanche and Chris Keyes here are the two attorneys who showed up on his behalf here today. So at 7 minutes past 3 o'clock here in the afternoon, already well underway. And where does this
We're going to break away from the live feed out of Miami, Florida, for the arraignment of former President Donald Trump. We're going to break away from the live feed out of Miami, Florida, for the arraignment of former President Donald Trump. We're going to go live to the Parliament of Jamaica, where they expect to say something. Read this, the 8-year-old who died because of her throat being slit. We're going to go live to the Parliament of Jamaica in the next couple of minutes. We're going to break away from our live feed in Miami, Florida, for the arraignment of former President Donald Trump.
Investigation to see if there had to be a special master appointed. So it's 3 people who are very familiar with the evidence sitting there at the prosecution table with former President Trump, who has now formally had a not guilty plea entered on his behalf, touching off what could be a long prosecution, David, complicated by the fact that it includes classified material. Whoever former President Trump chooses as his attorneys, at least one of them will no doubt need a security clearance. The judge will need a special briefing on handling classified material. And the discovery process, what evidence has to be turned over from the special counsel to Trump's legal team, is also a bit more complicated. And that will stretch this out maybe even longer than either side hopes.
Aaron, talk to us a little bit about the motorcade here, post-court appearance. It will take Donald Trump away from the federal court.